A Roman soldier marching through the forests of Gaul burned roughly 4,000 calories a day. The Roman army fed him on grain. That's it. Just grain. And yet, this same soldier could march 20 miles, dig a fortress, fight a battle, and do it all again the next day. For years. Sometimes decades. How? Most people imagine Roman soldiers feasting on roasted meat, drinking wine from golden cups, living like conquerors on the road. The reality was so much stranger, and so much harder, than that. The truth is that the Roman military diet looks, at first glance, like a punishment. Monotonous. Heavy. Repetitive to the point of psychological torture. Day after day after day of the same thing, ground by the same hands, cooked over the same fire. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. That diet, that seemingly brutal, barely varied ration, was not an accident. It was not poverty. It was not laziness. It was a precisely engineered system, designed by one of the most organizationally sophisticated civilizations in human history, to keep millions of soldiers functional across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. And once you understand how it actually worked, the calories, the logistics, the psychology, the moments when it broke down catastrophically, you will never look at a loaf of bread the same way again. Let's start with the foundation. The thing every Roman soldier's life was literally built on. Grain. Specifically, wheat. And the daily ration was enormous. Each legionary received roughly 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day, somewhere around 850 to 900 grams. That's not bread. That's raw grain. Wheat berries that the soldier himself was responsible for processing. He carried a hand mill. A small stone quern that weighed several pounds and was strapped to his already crushing pack. Every evening in camp, after the ditch was dug and the tent was pitched, a soldier would sit down and grind his grain by hand. 2 men often worked together, one holding the mill, one turning. It took time. It took effort. And then he mixed the rough flour with water and either baked it into a hard flatbread called bucellatum, boiled it into a thick porridge called pulse, or in the field, simply wrapped the dough around a stick and held it over the fire. Pulse was the older tradition, a dense, gluey paste of grain and water that the Romans themselves acknowledged was not a pleasure to eat. It was fuel. Nothing more. Soldiers who had been in the legions long enough sometimes spoke about pulse with a particular kind of resigned contempt, the way people today talk about airline food. You ate it because there was nothing else. You ate all of it because tomorrow you would need it. The bucellatum, the hard bread, sometimes baked twice to remove all moisture, could last for weeks without spoiling. Which was exactly the point. On forced marches when there was no time to cook, soldiers broke off chunks of it and chewed as they walked. It was dense enough to break teeth if you weren't careful. Old enough biscuit could require soaking in water before it was safely edible. This was breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the Roman legionary on campaign. And the army treated this supply with the seriousness of a weapon. Because grain was a weapon. The Roman military understood something that most ancient armies never fully grasped: you don't just need to feed your soldiers. You need to feed them predictably, reliably, at scale, across distances that would have seemed impossible to any logistical system before them. At its height, a single Roman legion of roughly 5,000 men required somewhere between 7 and 10 tons of grain every single day. Add the cavalry horses, the pack animals, the auxiliary forces, and you were looking at supply requirements that could exceed 50 tons of grain daily for a major campaigning army. The Romans moved this grain using a 3-tier system that was breathtaking in its organization. First tier, pre-positioned supply depots. Before a major campaign even began, the Roman military machine would spend months, sometimes years, establishing fortified supply points along the anticipated route of march. Grain was stockpiled, preserved, guarded. These weren't improvised stores. They were permanent structures, sometimes stone-built, positioned at intervals calculated to match the army's daily march distance. Second tier, the supply train. Every Roman army on campaign moved with an enormous tail of wagons and pack animals carrying current supplies. Historians estimate the supply train for a major Roman army could stretch for miles behind the combat formation. This was both a strength and a vulnerability, which we'll get to. Third tier, foraging and requisition. When supply lines stretched or the army moved faster than resupply could follow, Roman soldiers foraged. But even this was systematized. Foraging parties went out under armed escort, in organized groups, with specific collection targets. This wasn't looting. It was procurement. The difference mattered, both morally and practically, because an army that alienated every local population ran out of food faster than one that maintained something resembling order. Julius Caesar, in his accounts of the Gallic Wars, is almost obsessively focused on grain. He mentions it in nearly every major campaign decision. Before a battle, he notes whether the grain supply is secure. Before a march, he calculates where the next resupply point is. His tactical decisions, where to move, when to engage, when to withdraw, were often dictated not by the enemy in front of him, but by the grain situation behind him. But grain was not everything. Here is where the Roman diet becomes genuinely interesting. The army supplemented its ration with what modern nutritionists might reluctantly call a balanced diet, not by design of nutritional science, which didn't exist, but by practical evolution over centuries of keeping soldiers alive and functional. Legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, dried beans. These were part of the standard supply and provided the protein that pure grain couldn't. They were heavy to carry but dense in nutrition. A small handful of lentils boiled with grain transformed pulls from a carbohydrate paste into something that could actually rebuild muscle tissue damaged by marching. Posca. This was the universal Roman soldier's drink, and almost certainly the most important thing on this entire list. Posca was made from acetum, a low-quality wine vinegar, mixed with water. Sometimes herbs were added. Sometimes a little honey. It tasted sour, sharp, and strange by modern standards. But Posca served three critical functions. It made contaminated water safer to drink. The acidity of the vinegar killed many waterborne pathogens. It provided a small amount of vitamin C, protecting against scurvy on long campaigns. And it gave the soldier something that psychologically wasn't just water, a flavor, a small sensory variation in a diet of relentless monotony. When Jesus was offered a drink on the cross, the soldiers gave him Posca. It was not cruelty. It was the most common thing they had to drink. Salt. The Roman army took salt seriously enough that it became the origin of the word salary, from the Latin salarium, the salt ration or payment. Salt preserved food. Salt flavored the otherwise tasteless ration. Salt replaced electrolytes lost through sweating during brutal march days. A soldier without salt was a soldier whose body broke down faster. The army knew this. Supply records from Roman forts in Britain show salt listed alongside grain and weapons as a basic military supply. Olive oil. Wherever the supply lines could sustain it, olive oil was provided. Used for cooking, for preserving food, for treating leather, for cleaning weapons, and, this is something most people don't realize, for personal hygiene. Roman soldiers rubbed oil on their skin and scraped it off with a tool called a strigil. In the absence of soap, it was the primary cleaning method. So the same oil that went into your food also washed your body. And then, when the campaign was going well and the supply lines were short, there was wine. Wine deserves its own moment. The Roman military ration officially included wine, a sour, heavily watered version far removed from what wealthy Romans drank at their dinner parties. It was called vinum, and it was issued daily when available. Diluted typically 3 parts water to 1 part wine, it served the same purpose as Posca when vinegar wasn't available, making water palatable and marginally safer. But wine was also the emotional center of the soldier's day. After the grinding labor of the march, after the digging of the ditch, after the preparation of the meal, sitting around the fire with your contubernium, your 8 tent mates, sharing watered wine, that was as close to comfort as the legionary's life got. The army understood this. When wine supply was cut, when campaigns went long, when supply lines broke, when the army marched into territories where grapes didn't grow, morale degraded in ways that were documented and taken seriously. There are records of Roman commanders making significant logistical efforts specifically to restore wine supply to their troops, not because the soldiers needed it medically, but because they needed it humanly. There is something almost touching about that. This war machine of engineering and discipline, built on grain and vinegar, and it couldn't function without its soldiers having a cup of bad wine at the end of the day. Now let's stop admiring the system from above. Let's step inside it. You are a legionary. Somewhere in the 2nd century AD. You are on campaign in Dacia, modern-day Romania, in late autumn. The temperature at night drops below freezing. The terrain is mountainous. The supply lines are strained. Your daily ration arrived this morning. Grain, already ground into coarse flour, because the army has been moving fast and individual grinding hasn't been practical. There's a small amount of dried lentils at the bottom of the sack. Your Posca ration was short today, only half the usual amount. There is no wine. There hasn't been wine for 11 days. You build a fire that the wind keeps trying to kill. Your hands are so cold that mixing the flour and water is physically painful. The flatbread you produce is burned on one side, raw on the other, because the fire is uneven. You eat it anyway. All of it. You've learned to eat everything immediately, because the cold and the damp will ruin anything you try to save. Your tent mate Lucius has been eating less than his ration for 3 days. He says his stomach is wrong. You've seen this before. You know what it usually means. You say nothing because there is nothing useful to say. Tomorrow you march at first light. Probably 15 miles, maybe more. Uphill. You fall asleep tasting flour. And here is where the stakes become very, very real. The Roman military supply system was extraordinary. But it had a breaking point. And when armies found that breaking point, the results were catastrophic. Famine on campaign was not a theoretical risk. It happened. And when it did, discipline, the iron core of Roman military effectiveness, began to dissolve in ways that no punishment could fully arrest. Your daily ration arrived this morning. Grain, already ground into coarse flour, because the army has been moving fast and individual grinding hasn't been practical. There's a small amount of dried lentils at the bottom of the sack. Your Posca ration was short today, only half the usual amount. There is no wine. There hasn't been wine for 11 days. You build a fire that the wind keeps trying to kill. Your hands are so cold that mixing the flour and water is physically painful. The flatbread you produce is burned on one side, raw on the other, because the fire is uneven. You eat it anyway. All of it. You've learned to eat everything immediately, because the cold and the damp will ruin anything you try to save. Your tent mate Lucius has been eating less than his ration for 3 days. He says his stomach is wrong. You've seen this before. You know what it usually means. You say nothing because there is nothing useful to say. Tomorrow you march at first light. Probably 15 miles, maybe more. Uphill. You fall asleep tasting flour. And here is where the stakes become very, very real. The Roman military supply system was extraordinary. But it had a breaking point. And when armies found that breaking point, the results were catastrophic. Famine on campaign was not a theoretical risk. It happened. And when it did, discipline, the iron core of Roman military effectiveness, began to dissolve in ways that no punishment could fully arrest. During the later campaigns of the 3rd century AD, as the empire began to fracture politically and administratively, supply systems that had functioned for hundreds of years started to fail. Armies that couldn't be fed began to forage without restraint, looting the very provincial populations they were supposed to protect. This created a feedback loop of devastation. Farmers fled or stopped planting. Local food supplies collapsed. The next season's army found even less to requisition. The army ate the empire's future to feed its present. There were also acute disasters. During certain sieges, when Roman armies were themselves besieged or cut off, and this did happen, particularly during the Civil War periods, soldiers were documented eating their pack animals. Then their horses. In the most extreme recorded cases, foraging parties sent out in desperation simply never came back. Caesar himself, during particularly brutal stretches of the Gallic campaign, recorded his men being reduced to a meat-based diet, something Romans considered deeply abnormal and faintly barbaric. When they finally reached a grain supply again, he noted the psychological relief in terms that made it clear the men hadn't just been hungry. They had been unmade, slightly, by the violation of their food expectations. Because food is never just fuel. The Roman soldier knew that. The Roman army knew that. And when the system broke, it wasn't just bodies that suffered. Now here's what makes this remarkable in context. Compare the Roman supply system to the armies it fought against. The Gauls under Vercingetorix were fierce, brave, and tactically intelligent. But their supply system was essentially non-existent by Roman standards. They lived off the land, which worked brilliantly in friendly territory and collapsed the moment they were besieged or driven away from familiar ground. Vercingetorix's ultimate strategy at Alesia was actually to use scorched earth, burning his own countryside to deny Caesar's army forage. It almost worked. Almost. Medieval European armies, more than a millennium after Rome's peak, were still largely dependent on pillaging for food on campaign. The concept of a structured military supply train with prepositioned depots was essentially lost. English armies during the 100 Years' War, in the 1300s and 1400s, were regularly devastated not by French swords but by dysentery and starvation from inadequate food supply. The Chivorci, the deliberate raiding of enemy farmland, was a military strategy largely because these armies had no other reliable way to feed themselves. The Mongols solved the problem differently, by moving fast enough on horseback that they could cover enormous distances, living off dried meat, dried milk curds, and horse blood in emergencies. Efficient. Brutal. But ultimately limited in its ability to sustain large forces in fixed operations. Rome's system was unique because it was designed for scale and duration. Not raiding. Not foraging. Not speed. Sustained, organized, mass feeding of professional soldiers over years of continuous campaigning. No ancient civilization came close to matching it. Very few modern ones have matched the organizational sophistication, proportionally speaking. So here is your answer. What did Roman soldiers eat on campaign? Grain. Ground by hand, cooked over a fire, eaten twice a day, in every weather, in every corner of the known world. Supplemented by lentils, salt, olive oil, Posca, and when the gods were generous, sour wine. But that answer, the list of foods, misses the actual story. The real answer is that Roman soldiers ate a system. A supply chain that began in Egyptian granaries and African wheat fields, moved through fortified depots and organized wagon trains, passed through the hands of officers who tracked every pound like a battlefield commander, and ended up in a soldier's calloused hand somewhere in the dark at the edge of the empire. The food wasn't special. The organization behind it was extraordinary. Rome didn't build the ancient world's greatest military by equipping its soldiers with the best weapons or training them in the most sophisticated tactics, though it did both. It built that military by solving the most fundamental problem of warfare: how do you keep men alive, functional, and fighting when everything around them is trying to kill them? You feed them. Reliably. Systematically. Every single day. For 500 years. Here's what I want you to think about. The Roman soldier ate the same thing almost every day. Monotonous, hard, unremarkable food. And from that ordinary foundation, he built one of the most extraordinary military civilizations in human history. We live in an age of infinite dietary choice, and most of us have never done anything close to what those men did. What does that say about the relationship between simplicity and capability? Between constraint and performance? Leave your answer below. I read every one. And if you want to know what happened when Roman soldiers got sick on campaign, when the system that kept them alive started to break down from the inside, that story involves Roman military medicine, field surgery without anesthesia, and a level of organizational sophistication that will genuinely shock you. That one is coming next.